Hello, everyone. Welcome to the National Widowers Organization monthly Zoom meeting, where we seek to provide grief support for those who have lost a spouse, partner, or any significant loved one. The NWO and the Men's Grief Network is a nonprofit group bringing men together in grief. Our organization is led by experts in loss, many of whom are widowers and others who have grieved significant losses. The NWO offers free of charge resources, including articles, blogs, books, peer-to-peer support, and more to help men during this very difficult time and beyond. As men, we don't have to go through loss alone, whether it be the loss of a spouse, child, parent, friend, or sibling. I'm NWO board member and fellow widower Ken Levy, your host for tonight. Our topic is the conundrum of absences and presences, reflections on the death of my wife and grandson. Tonight's program features widower Ted Bowman, who experienced both the loss of his wife and grandson. Ted is a grief educator and consultant. For over 40 years, he has been a frequent trainer, consultant, and speaker with many groups throughout the Minnesota, US, and UK, and other countries. Ted was also an adjunct professor at the University of Minnesota, at the University of St. Thomas, and United Theological Seminary of the Twin Cities. Ted is the author of articles and chapters appearing in books, journals, newspapers, and magazines. His booklets, Loss of Dreams, A Special Kind of Grief, and Finding Hope When Dreams Have Shattered, are widely used in grief care. His latest book, Ambitious Parables, Poem and Prose of Loss and Renewal, was published in November of 2021. Tonight, Ted will share responses to his grandson's death in 2017 and his wife's death in 2020. Further, he will address the intersection of the personal and professional when losses occur. After the conversation, we're going to have a Q&A. So share comments and questions with us in the chat box. Please send them throughout the event. If Ted says something that triggers a thought or a comment, we'll get to as many as we can. So with that, Ted, I'm going to turn it over to you.
Okay. Thanks, Ken. Good evening to you. It's wonderful to be here again. I had the privilege and honor of interacting with this group in August of last year, and to be invited once was a treat. To be invited twice, wow, that's quite the treat. And so I look forward to our interactions. And as Ken just suggested, I want this to be an interaction as much conversational as this kind of platform allows. So use the chat, and then I'm going to try to reserve at least 15 minutes or more for Q&A after I share a few slides at the beginning, probably 15 or 20 minutes, just to help us orient to this theme that you see on the screen just now, and begin to share some of my stories. And then I'm going to move away from the slides and share a bit more about my wife's death in 2020 and my grandson's death in 2017, with some of the ways that I have coped, as a way of prompting you to think about some of your questions of coping and reacting. There's my email on the front page. I share that and invite you to be in contact with me, because I'm aware that after sessions like this, some of our best questions happen 2 hours later or even 2 days later. And Ken and the group know how to be in touch with me as well. So let's jump in. Throughout our lives, we are storing and restoring after disruptive changes. And so it often involves grieving the old story before creating the next, not necessarily new story. Some of you who were with me in August will remember the story that Judith Viorst shared about a little boy. My mom says I'm her sugar plum. My mom says I'm her lamb. My mom says I'm completely perfect just the way I am. My mom says I'm a special, wonderful, terrific little guy. My mom just had another baby. Why? There it is. Our worlds began to change. Our story begins to be altered. In fact, my wife and I had a boy who knocked on our door. This is probably 15 years ago. And I opened the door and saw Stevie outside. And I said, "Hi, Stevie, how you doing?" He said, do you want a baby?" And I thought he was talking about a cat or a dog or a gerbil or something. And no, he said, "My mom's pregnant. We don't need another one." So that's a simple early example of how our stories change. And so look at that again. Story and reading story after loss involves grieving the old story before creating the next, not necessarily new story. You'll always be our firstborn. Nobody can ever be the same as you, but the child knows that they're going to have to share space. They're probably going to be hand-me-downs, all of those things. And so listen for major components, themes, values of the old story. How can they be reframed in the new story for you and me as widowers or as grieving grandparents, whatever our story might be? So what does that mean in terms of loss? If you ask people to free associate on the words grief and loss, about 65, 70% typically say in surveys has to do with bereavement, with death. But look at the definition. Loss refers to being deprived of or ceasing to have something that one formerly possessed or to which one was attached. A role. For me, I'm now a widower instead of a spouse. We lose our job. We're no longer employed. We retire or we are redundant, those kinds of things. We move from health to less health because of a medical or mental health condition. So it refers to being deprived of or ceasing to have something that one formerly possessed or to which one was attached, a way of life. Think about here in Minnesota, that's where I am tonight, that's where I live. March 6, 2020 was one of those lost moments. It was the first confirmed case of COVID. Think about our life on March 5th. Think about our lives on March 6th and 7th, and ever since. And so loss comes first, and then the whole body's response is to grieve it. And that's confusing because it can be emotional, the sadness, the tears, the rage, the anger, cognitive. How fast was he driving? What does stage 4 cancer mean? Do we have enough insurance? How do you do a funeral in the midst of the pandemic? Spiritual, what kind of world? What kind of God? Does this make sense? And a visceral response to loss. Why am I so tired? I just am not clear these days. I don't want to make another decision right now. And the piece that I'm going to add to this, I didn't put a slide in, is we need to also think about what we call grief, loss accumulation. And loss accumulation is from the moment of your birth until this very hour. Loss overload, and that's going to vary from person to person, can be the last 3 weeks, the last 3 months, the last 3 years. If there are too many disruptive changes and losses, then that exacerbates the definitions that you see here. So what happens when losses occur? Our stories change. And we'll talk about our own stories in just a bit. Ken has a story that he is willing to share. I certainly am going to share mine. You may know Joan Didion's book, The Year of Magical Thinking. She and her husband came home from dinner in New York. They were sitting late in the afternoon having probably a glass of wine and some snacks. And she suddenly became aware that the other side of the room was quiet. And she began writing her book. Life changes fast. Life changes in the instant you sit down to dinner, and life as you know it ends. Whew. So sudden. C.S. Lewis, he was at Oxford in England, kind of one of those Renaissance men, knew a lot about everything, and married an American woman late in his life, and she died about 3 years later. And he began to write this. I thought I could describe a state, make a map of sorrow. Sorrow, however, turns out not to be a state, but a process. There's something new to be chronicled every day. It's a life, it's a valley, a winding valley. Our stories are changed. And then Julian Barnes, also from England, uses these metaphors. Grief configures time, also space. You enter a new cartography, the desert of loss, the lake of indifference, the bog of self-pity, caverns of memory. How would you describe your own losses and the way that you are grieving whatever is going on in your particular life? A lot of my work has also been, as Ken was saying, around what I call loss of dreams or shattered dreams. It's when the pictures inside of the way that we thought life would go don't turn out the way it is. This sucks. I don't want this. This is not fair. Why don't they warn you? Never thought it would happen in our family. Any of those kind of responses, as you can see, if you are able to see the two faces on the screen, I'm wearing glasses. There's a conspicuous loss. Ken is not wearing glasses. And so if I were looking at you, if we could see all of the faces, I would have no clue in the room who tonight has a shattered dream. But a shattered dream has to do with losing an emotionally important image of oneself, a partner, a spouse, an employee, one's family, one's life, one's work, even one's death. Who am I now? Here I am, an aging man in the latter years of my life. How do I think of myself? Losing the possibilities of what might have been. What if, what if, what if? Abandonment of plans for a particular future. My wife and I, you'll hear a bit more of that story a bit later, had just celebrated our 41st anniversary. We talked about 41 years together and began to talk about our future. What monies did we have? How healthy were we? Where did we want to go? What were some of our passions? What's next? Abandonment of plans for a particular future when someone dies, the dying of dreams. So what I'm speaking about, going over some ground here just to give you a few different images and metaphors for what we call grief and loss and widowhood. Tom Attig, especially about bereavement, says that people after a death have to be relearning their world. Who am I now as a grieving grandpa? Who am I now as a widower? And it overlaps with narrative therapist Michael White from Australia and New Zealand. His concept of reauthoring stories began as he perceived the parallels between literary stories, fiction, song lyrics, all of those kinds of things, memoirs, poetry, to what he saw in therapy with his clients. And he said, effective therapy, he asserted, is about engaging people in the reauthoring of the compelling plights of their lives. If we had the time tonight to go around the circle, I would be eager to hear you to say, hello, my name is Ted. How would you introduce yourself now, given what's happened in recent years in your life? So here are my stories. I'll elaborate these a bit later. But my grandson, Chris, was injured in a football game, age 17. His collarbone was reset, a clean break, and then he was given pain meds, which today we would call opioids, that he was to use for the first few days. For over 6 years, Chris was in and out of treatment programs and addiction services. He received full family support. He was even in 3 intensive overnight treatment programs. But I'm pausing here because he was never able to move from the using life to the sober life, never able to make that big step. And so he died of an overdose in 2017 at age 23. So tonight is a tender time. When I got the invitation, it didn't hit me until later that he was born on April 14th, years ago, 30 years ago today, or 30 years ago this month, and he died next week, April 28th. So this is a tender month for me. Here's the other story, and I was asked to come because often the focus is on widowhood, but lots of us are dealing with multiple losses at a time, and certainly I am. My wife and Marge, I mentioned this, celebrated 41 years of marriage at a quarantine holiday in July 2020, so just a few months into the pandemic. We looked back with pride, seized our moments, planned for the future, not knowing that within 48 hours of returning home here to St. Paul, she would die of sudden cardiac arrest on July 29th, 2020. No history of heart disease, no precursors of a heart attack. And she called from the other room and said, Ted, there's a pain in my chest. And I went running to her, and by the time I even got there, she was already going and gone. I'm wondering what your stories are and what this evokes for you. Here's what's so important, and the reason I'm willing to share my story. Maya Angelou wrote years ago, she says, there's no greater agony than bearing an untold story inside. So I love it what this organization is doing with widowers, and especially with men, to give us permission to meet with each other and to share our stories. I just have done a group, 2 groups with a group of men here in Minnesota called Face It. The men started off having kind of low-level depression, not what you'd call clinical depression, but they had retired. They had experienced a medical or mental health issue, and they had trouble talking about it. And this group called Face It gives them permission to tell their untold stories. It's a wonderful group, similar to the one that you're part of tonight. Ken Hardy says something similar. It's one thing to lose something important to you, but it's far worse when no one in your universe recognizes that you've lost it. What a relief for me to be here with you. And I hope that I can support you, that we can begin to talk about these things. The failure to acknowledge another's loss is to deny that person's humanity. So yes, I'm taking some risk by sharing my own story, but I'm also healing because of sharing my story. Arthur Frank says, telling people does not come easily, neither does listening. Seriously ill and also seriously grieving people are wounded not just in body, but in voice. They need to become storytellers in order to recover the voices that illness and grief can take away. The voice speaks the mind and expresses the spirit, but is also a physical organ of the body. The mystery of illness and grieving stories is their expression of the body. Remember what I said about that at times you just feel as if you can't make a good decision today because you're grieving. Your whole body is grieving. And so in the silences between words, the tissues speak. So what is your body saying? So part of what I'm trying to advocate is we even welcome a death that's off time or where you become a widow. I love this poem from the 13th century poet Rumi, a Middle Eastern poet, and he likens being human to a guest house. Look at the line there. This being human is a guest house. What a metaphor. And then he says, every morning a new arrival. And then I love it. He has an arc of life, a joy, a depression, a meanness. Some momentary awareness comes as an unexpected visitor. Cardiac arrest, overdose, loss of job, COVID, the news of the day from Gaza and from Israel, from Ukraine, from Somalia, wherever it might be. And then this strange line in the 13th century, welcome and entertain them all. Not welcome in the sense of spin or rose-colored glasses. Look on the bright side. Oh, you'll learn something from this. oh my, it'll take you time, but you'll get through it. All those kind of what I call Minnesota cheer up. No, even how do I welcome the tragic? The words I never want to hear, the words I never want to say. How do we begin even to welcome that? And that's what this organization is all about, that we can begin to say the words, we can begin to be with one another and even try to embrace the losses that we're experiencing. And so here's the title that we've used for this one. It's Wisdom from Anna Quinlan. She says, the world loves closure, loves the thing that can, as they say, be gotten through. That was the old way that men did it. Get back on the horse, get back to work. Don't talk about it too much, just get over it. That's why it comes as a great surprise to find that loss is forever. Oh my gosh, woof. Then it goes on, that 2 decades after the event, 30 years after the event, 3 weeks after the event, there are those occasions when something in you cries out at the continual presence of an absence. Ooh, what a conundrum. Presence and absence. So there we are, having those two together. So here are a couple of things that I wrote. I'm just going to give you a preview. I'm going to share some more in just a bit. But this is a piece I wrote about Chris. I was a disciplined writer for a year after he died in 2017. So this is a piece I wrote, ironically, in this month of April, because Prince, the singer from Minnesota, died just Sunday a few years ago, April 21st. So I wrote this piece to Prince and to my grandson, because here's the song from one of Prince's songs, the lyrics, dearly beloved, we're gathered here today to get through this thing called life. You can look it up from his song, Let's Go Crazy. And so then I wrote this, oh, Prince, I want to sing along with you. I do for the first stanza, life, life, gathered with others. I need all the help I can get. I love your use of the we word. We are gathered here today. That's what we're doing even here tonight. Life is crazy, yes. For you, for my grandson, it was. Each of you died of an overdose. Did you both go crazy? I feel crazy more often than desired. This is not about judgment. This is about mysteries, about love, music, crossroads, where pain, suffering converge. I'm still on the road trying to get through life, trying to see the sun, day or night, awaiting whatever tomorrow brings, confident with beloveds, like the guys gathered here tonight. I will make it. Prince and Chris, I miss you, each of you. Part of my way of coping is to try to find words and to speak my grief out loud through words that I sometimes just share with myself, but sometimes, as with this one, I share with you. Here's another. Laurie Ann Basselaire, her husband died, and she had a line in one of her poems called, "I needed for months to remember our rooms." And it so grabbed me that I thought, oh my gosh, all of our stories are placed. And my life with Marge for 41 years was in our rooms. So here are just a few stanzas of a longer poem that I wrote using Basileur's metaphor of rooms. I live in our rooms, not my rooms, nor my place. For years, first in one home, then now in another, we lived in our rooms. These are rooms in which we blended histories with families, friends, laughter, tears too, many tears, oh, the stories. Every nook and county evokes memories. Marge is all around this apartment I'm sitting in right now. It's strange without her physical presence. Death quarantines the living. Remember, she died in the midst of the pandemic. To move through rooms in spirit and perceive presence. Are you hearing in both of these what I'm trying to say about absence and presence, that they can overlap, that they are with us all the time? So just a bit more in terms of a couple of slides, and then I'm just going to share a bit more of my story and then give us some time to talk with one another. So what I'm using tonight is what technically is called bibliotherapy, narrative therapy. So bibliotherapy, often referred to as poetry therapy, therapeutic storytelling, is one of the creative arts therapies. So if you go online to NACADA, the National Coalition for Creative Arts Therapies, you'll find music, art, drama, dancing, all of the creative arts that involve, but mine, bibliotherapy, involves storytelling and the reading of specific texts or writing for the purpose of healing. Because since stories evoke stories, the use of stories in grief work is for the purpose of prompting responses from the grieving person. So if you are having trouble finding your own voice because the emotions are hard to get to, or cognitively you just don't want to think about it, sometimes it's easier to start with a story out here in front of us. And so I choose song lyrics, I choose poetry, I choose memoirs, I choose a variety of ways in which the stories of others evoke my stories. And so that's the purpose of bibliotherapy. And when we do it, I look for stories that can move between these two circles. This is an oscillation model that some colleagues in the Netherlands conceived is the way most people grieve best, that we need times and places and people with which to do the loss orientation, the grief work, the intrusion of grief, being ambushed, the stories, all of that. But we also need times and places and venues and people for restoration. Life changes, doing new things, distraction. I don't want to talk about that today, and new roles and relationships as we begin to process these things. So here's an example from Denise Levertov about moving toward restoration. I have only one small grain of hope. Oh gosh, I need more. But I break off a fragment of my hope to send you. Please take this grain of hope so that mine won't shrink, because giving the gift feeds me as well, so mine won't shrink. Please share your fragments so that yours will grow. Only by division will hope increase. That hope is contagious. So we gather tonight to share some of our stories. So as Ken mentioned earlier, here are a few of the things that I've written in terms of shattered dreams and ambiguous parables. And those are available if you want to come to my website, or they also are available in Amazon and places like that, but perhaps not in local bookstores. So just a bit more before we move to discussion, to talk about lessons I've learned as being a grieving grandfather, as well as a grieving spouse, now a widower. I've already spoken to my story may be a little different from yours because of loss accumulation and loss overload. These are two intimate deaths within a 7-year time. Other people have died, friends, people close to me. My parents died even earlier, so I'm now part of the older generation. But it's that loss accumulation and overload. And part of what I want to share about that is that whatever is the current loss may surprise you because it will remind you of previous losses. And you'll be surprised that you're not only grieving being a widower, but you're also thinking about a grandson, thinking about a friend who's died, thinking about the early death of a companion animal or of your grandpa or whatever it might have been. And so that happens. And so part of what I've learned, and this is one of their early poems in Loss of Dreams, is again from Denise Levertov, "Ah, grief, I should not treat you like a homeless dog who comes to the back door for a crust, for a meatless bone. I should trust you. I should coax you into my house, give you your own corner, a worn mat to lie on, your own water dish. You think I don't know you've been living under my porch?" That grief is all around. And so I want to be ready to embrace it. If I'm not ready to talk about it that particular day, Virginia Satir, another teacher of mine, says, at least practice a little Minnesota hospitality and invite the grief in. Say, oh, here you are again. I think of Paul Simon's song, "Hello, Darkness, My Old Friend." My revision of that is, "Hello, grief, my old friend." And so if I'm not ready to deal with my grief that particular day, a satir would say, well, show the grief to a room where they can be comfortable and say, I'll be with you a few hours from now, but I just need some time to be on my own, or I've got to do some work, but tell me about my grief a bit later. So I want to talk to my grief and allow it to be around me. And then in terms of the overload that I spoke of, let's go back even this slide of hope and also this restoration and so on. Here's an example of grief accumulation and overload. Rejoicing in having survived 2 years since being diagnosed with stage 4 ovarian cancer, she welcomed her garden's gifts of succulent tomatoes and squash and made further peace. So there's one, the current loss is cancer. And what seemed like a century ago in that same garden, her son's suicide. Her son killed himself in the garden. Then driving to church on the radio, she heard that we had just begun bombing Afghanistan. This is obviously a few years ago. We could replace that now with Gaza and with Israel and all of the other world things that are going. Sobbing, unable to see through her tears, she pulled over and surrendered to new grief at now losing her love of the world and the peace she hoped to die in. That's what I mean by grief overload, grief accumulation. And lots of us are not just being a widow, but grieving what I call the state of the world, the state of the world. So let me go to my grandson's story. And as I said earlier, it's a tender month because this is April 14th and 28th are tender days for me. And so there we are with dealing with the ambiguity. In the book that I mentioned of ambiguous parables, here's a bit from the preface to the book that deals with Chris as well as with Marge. The collected prose and poetic pages herein are the voice of a man seeking greater comfort with ambiguity. What seems to be is not always what is. A lifelong quest has been to find words, the words of others through conversations, poetry, song lyrics, fiction, nonfiction, scriptures, or my own words to acknowledge and address ambiguous experiences. So that's part of what I've been trying to do around these kinds of experiences. So here are two examples in terms of Chris that I want to share with you. Uh, and, and dealing with these issues. I mentioned earlier the one with Prince, but I still have some ambiguity about Chris and his inability to step over from the using life to the sober life. And so here's a piece I wrote called What the Bee Sees, B-E-E. A photographer friend does the unusual. He takes photos of flowers from the perspective of a bee. He dives deep inside beyond the colorful bud, the surrounding leaves, to see the inner heart of a flower, what the bee sees. I wished for such a camera. I wished for abilities not possessed. I wished for clairvoyance. I wondered how my grandson saw himself, his inner and outer self. What would I have seen had my grandson let me inside, beyond his hardening shell, beyond his lovable, attractive surface, to his inner voice of yearnings, wounds of shattered dreams, his desires about relationships? Where was his nectar and pollen? What fed his soul, spirit, body? I'm full of questions, sadness, for my grandson searches no longer for nectar, pollen, or people. I'm stung by his dying, never seeing what he saw. I want to tell him what I saw from all my vantage points. I want him to know the beauty I came upon from his, to know the beauty I came upon from his early flower and his birth. Like a bee, I wanted to see inside his flower, even though I deeply loved his outer layers. I'm trying to express my grief around ambiguity. He and I talked at length over the 7 years that he was not able to step over from the using life to the sober life, even while he was in jail and prison, because he was arrested because they found a gun in the back seat of his car. It was not his, but one of his so-called buddies. And he was the one arrested because it was in his car. But I still don't know. What was it that got in the way of his moving forward? What was it that caused him to not go well? Here's one example of one more piece of that, and then I'll share a couple of things about Marge and being a widow. Iris Bolton also had a son in her case, in this case, a son who killed himself by suicide. And here's what she wrote after some years of grieving. I don't know why. I'll never know why. I don't have to know why. I don't like it. What I have to do is to make a choice about my own living. I'm trying to live her words. Because with Chris, I don't know why. I'll never know why. I don't have to know why. I don't like it. What I have to do is to make a choice about my own living. So that's what I mean by bibliotherapy. I use someone else's words to begin to try to help me to find some of my own words. So now a few words about Marge and being a widow, and then let's move quickly to have some Q&A. And Ken and Adam are going to help us if you have things that you want to put in the chat. Part of what I certainly am aware of with Marge's death being a sudden death. Here we are, 41 years of marriage. We just had a quarantined anniversary holiday, wonderful lovemaking and time together and food and talking about our past and present and future, not knowing, as I said, that she would die within 48 hours. So here's a piece by a British colleague that certainly makes sense to me much more than it did earlier. It's called Say It Now. This is John Hedgley. Don't hold on until it's time to go before you let your emotional side show. Don't hold on until tomorrow. Don't hold on for another moment. Saying I love you is not original, but nor is never letting someone know. Why leave it till it's almost time to say the last goodbye before you say the big hello? Don't hold on until the gate. And he goes on and on and on. Say it now. Say it now. So if there's anything I've learned from Marge's death, but also from my mom's death as she moved over a 6-year period into the fog of Alzheimer's. So we lost our mother before we lost our mother. Is if I have anything to say to anybody in my life that's of meaning to me, Damn it, I want to say it now. I want to say it now. Don't leave it till it's much too late. But here's a way in which a person like you and this group that we are sitting in tonight, MGN and the widowers group, I was sharing with a male friend of mine my struggle. This is about 6 or 7 months after Marge died, that I loved having a word, widower, because of all the deaths in families. There's only one death that has a word or a phrase that's non-judgmental. It's called widower and widow and widower. It's simply an announcement that there is a spouse or partner who's died. What a lovely phrase. There's no word for a child's death. There's no word for a grandson's death. There's no word for a sibling's death. There's no word for a parent's death. But I was struggling with, I liked having a word, but I was struggling with the words associated with being a widower. I'm now a single man. I'm now living a solo life. And I shared this with a male friend, and too quickly on my timing, he said, "Oh, Ted, you've never been single." And I wanted to hit him because I thought he was engaging in Minnesota Cheer Up. And I said, "Don't do this. This is hard enough. Don't try to change the subject. Don't try to make it better." He said, "No, no, 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 Ted. I'm not doing that at all. Let me tell you what I'm saying." And here's what he did. It was just a lovely, lovely thing. I hope we can do it with each other tonight. He said, "Ted, I've known you for 25 years. In those 25 years, we've talked about your earlier 25 years. Ted, you've always had a collection of friends and family and people in your life. Ted, I've been part of that collection of friends and family and people for the last 25 years. Ted, I'm not leaving your collection. Ted, you can't push me aside. Ted, you've always had these people. Ted, you're not single." That's what we call reframing. It didn't change anything, and yet it changed everything, because it helped me to reframe loneliness and being alone. Yes, I'm alone a lot of the time because I'm a single man. I live a solo life. When I get up in the morning, there's no one to have morning conversation with, no one to plan for what we do today. But I'm not lonely. I've got all kinds of people in my life, including some of these books and some of these song lyrics and some of these poems that mean so much to me that are around me and so on, as well as a group of people like you. And so it's a reframing. And I love it when we can do that with one another and find some kind of new meaning. So I'm going to pause there because I've shared a bit of my losses and move to some discussion. I think we've got a bit of time here before our time ends up, maybe even 15 minutes or so. So I hope you are using the chat and that Ken and Adam will monitor that. If you haven't already, shoot a question or share your own story. And then I'm going to ask Ken to share one of his writings because it's meant so much to me that he shared it with me in just a few minutes. Or Ken, do you want to go ahead and do that right at the start?
Sure. Well, Ted, I just wanted to get to some of our viewers and listeners as far as like some of the comments that have come in first. And thank you for that. That was a wonderful presentation. And I'm sure I know I connected with quite a lot of everything that you were saying, and I'm sure our audience did as well. We have a viewer that asked the question, when an old story, in quotes, is filled with trauma and sadness, and I suppose obviously relate to that with your grandson. When an
Yeah.
old story is filled with trauma and sadness, do we retell that story or do we change the story?
Let me first respond and say one size does not fit all. And so people will do this differently. But what I urge is that we it's the old admonition, the direction in which you look will determine what you see. And so if we only look to the troubles, to the tainted death, to the overdose, to the suicide, to the homicide, to putting yourself in harm's way, that's only part of the story. I'm not saying that we should dodge that, but I am saying what lots of people say is there's more to me than my cancer. There's more to me than my depression. There's more to me than my addiction. And what I'm saying is there is more to me than the way that someone died. Some people get more focused on how someone died, that they fail to grieve the death of the person. Yes, I still have some ambiguity about how Chris died, but my grief is I miss my grandson. There's my grief about his death, however it happened. And so to separate how someone died from the actual grieving, Terry Tempest Williams put this way because she's also a grief educator. And someone said to her, Terry, you look as if you're married to sorrow. And her response was, no, I'm not married to sorrow. I just choose not to look away. I just choose not to look away. And so, yes, sometimes the story will be a combination. That's the oscillation model, that we may be grieving both the death, but also how it occurred. But there's also restoration. And I do have, because I had the 23 years with Chris, wonderful, pleasant memories about his smile, about his athleticism. I even wrote another poem. I won't read it fully to you, but he was a wrestler in high school and a wonderful wrestler. And so he taught me a new word about grieving. My grandson has often spoken about bulk, B-U-L-K. It was a common term when he gave me his update: weight gained, weights lifted, rotations done. And he's talking about his getting ready for the next wrestling match and so on. Last week, I bulked grief. The size and weight surpassed all previous losses. And so I'm using even his death to use one of his words to help me to find my healing. So that would be my response to this wonderful question.
Thank you, Ted. I would say, as far as like songs, one song that always moves me and touched me right from the moment I entered into this desert of grief myself was a song called November. And the group is Azure Ray, A-Z-Z-U-R-E, Ray, R-A-Y. So if anybody wants to look that up on YouTube, very moving song indeed. And I have another comment here. It says, besides writing poems or stories, you mentioned you use songs. Do the songs provoke inspiration for you to write your poetry, or do you use songs to reflect on your losses?
Both and all the more, all the above and much more. A grandson and I, when Marge died, my wife died, and his grandmother had been very dear to him. He and I together began to put together a playlist on both of our computers and our phones. And he added some songs, I added some songs, and they're both there for healing, for our own just listening to and reminding us. So it's all any song that either we associated with Marge or that we found did a bit of her story, had a line in it and something. For example, there's a current song that we both put on by Bruce Springsteen called "One Morning." One morning, one moment you're here, the next moment you're gone. Just that line. One moment you're here, the next moment you're gone, and he's talking about someone leaving. But it's not a death song, but it's for me, it's a death song. And I love Bruce and I love his music. And so sometimes it prompts other writing, as I did with Prince. I use the song from Let's Go Crazy to prompt me to write a poem. I didn't send it to Prince. He was already dead because he died soon after or before Chris died. But it was using music to prompt me to do my own writing. So yes, all of the above.
And we have another comment regarding lessons learned. I loved your idea of welcoming grief, my old friend, and the idea that we could place our grief on hold until we're ready to deal or face it.
Yeah. There's a wonderful piece by a grandson who came over to his granny's house after the grandfather had died. And as one of those, the funeral had been held, so it's now a few days later. And this like 6-year-old turns to his granny and says, Granny, do you ever want to talk about grandpa? Or do you never want to talk about grandpa? What a question. And she knew this was a threshold, a big one for a young child, and said that she wanted to get it right. So there are times I want to talk about it because we had a wonderful life together. But there are the times that I can't because it feels private or it's just not a good day to do it. But on the whole, I want to talk, which I thought was a lovely response of a grandmother to a grandson about uh, pick and choose.
Right. Right. Sometimes we get advice as widowers, people who are deeply grieving, whether it's a spouse or child, that we would be well advised to embrace life again, and they would want us to be happy. I always found that to be very valid advice because I know that my wife would want me to be happy, but at the same time, there's that dual feeling that I just can't get past the sadness and even the anger at times. So there's that um, duality of held belief about wanting to re-engage in life and at the same time still not wanting to let go necessarily of some of those other components there that keep me grounded
Right. Well,
in
that's
that.
the reason for the theme of this evening, the continual presence of an absence. And what I want to suggest that I don't think I shared this earlier, Ken, is that some of those moments that we are going to be uh, uh, that we can plan for our grieving, that we even know that those are going to be tender. For me, as I've already said, I know that April is a tender month for me because of Chris' birthday and his death day both occurring in April. And so I know that I'm walking on tender ground every April that comes around. So that is predictable. And so we can plan for it. It's the way that some people do when they go to the cemetery. It's what some people do when they have a remembrance event and so on. So we can plan for it. The other side that we don't plan for, and that's the continual presence of an absence, is what we call being ambushed when we are triggered. And those are things that happen in our lives where we weren't expecting to be grieving that day. We thought we were even going through a rough or a good patch in our lives. And all of a sudden, we smell something. We hear a song on the radio. Someone says something, and all of a sudden, we're brought back to our grieving. That happened. I was just doing a session last Sunday at a church here in Minnesota, and one of the persons spoke up and said, I was talking about in this case, the, perhaps having multiple funerals or being willing to grieve again and again and again. In some ways, as Ken, you were just talking about. And she said, my father died when I was 18. My older son is now 18. You just reminded me of something I've been knowing about, but I didn't have words for until today. She was triggered. She was
Mm.
ambushed because simply the number 18 was now associated. What if I died tomorrow? What does my son know about me? Because she was wondering, what does she know about the father who died at age 8 when he was 18, when she was 18?
Mm.
So that's the triggering, that's the ambush. So we need to be ready for both the continual presence of an absence, but it's not. Remember the dual process is you don't have to spend all the time on the grieving side, nor do you spend all the time on the restoration side. It's the ability to oscillate and move back and forth. Nell Nodding says it may not be the case that joy and grief can occur simultaneously, but they can occur alternately within nanoseconds.
Right. Right. Well, that's that tender time of this month for you. I share that feeling about the month of November, which is one of the reasons I mentioned that specific song earlier. Highly recommend people check it out. Again, it's by a band called Azure Ray. So, in keeping with what you were just mentioning, Ted, um, may I read the poem that I wrote because
Oh,
this
please do. I want this. Yes.
directly really addresses that duality.
Yeah, he shared it with me and it was just such a gift to me. I want it to be a gift to everybody. Ken, go ahead.
Thank you. It's called In the Season of Sadness, Autumn. Just to preface it again, my wife passed in November. She was born in October, so that whole time of year has quite a lot of significance. So this is called In the Season of Sadness. Autumn, the season of your birth, falling leaves, bracing chill, pink ribbons. The times I watched you at the finish line of your beloved New York City Marathon. Amid a sea of silver blankets, you emerged. The season we moved, saw Vermont, Italy, Spain, the US Open, the season we got married. It is also the season of your passing. Endless waiting rooms, biopsies, infusions of chemo and pain. Fear, never knowing how to answer your question, am I going to die? It is years since I kissed you, and tears still trace a slow path down my cheek. I never realized how much confidence your love gave me, and how cold the fall nights could be without you. I lurch forward and fall backward. I am still so very uncomfortable in this widow's skin. It is amputation, an emotional stroke. I sense you are near, but far away. Every day I still awaken, though I don't know how. My body still functions without my knowledge or permission. Cancer also functions without a body's permission. God, doctors, immune cells, you are the body's foot soldiers. How could you not protect? In my mind, I brush your cheek like a pebble casting a ripple on a pond. My breath, my rock, how I miss you. It is years since I kissed you. My challenge is to have this season of sadness, which will forever bring with it pain, coexist with a season of joy. For autumn is also the season you were born, the season we wed, the season you ran, and the season we lived.
Wow. Oh, good to hear the voice. I read it, but I had my voice and was trying to imagine yours. But Ken, you and I had not talked earlier, so I'm so thrilled to hear the voice. Thank you.
Sure. I think we're at time. I would really like to thank you, Ted, for your wonderful insights in tonight's presentation. And if you're interested in seeing this again, if you missed part of it, I'll be giving you some information about how to do that. This has been a great conversation. I'd like to thank all of you for coming tonight. We want you to know that you're not alone. Always feel free to reach out to us. And if you want more info, email us or check out our websites, nationalwidowers.org and mensgriefnetwork.org, where you'll find many resources and links to this and other workshops available on our YouTube channel. And we want to remind you to join us on the fourth Wednesday of every month for our NWO Zoom workshops at 8:30 Eastern Standard Time. Next month, our May 29th workshop will be on the topic of ketamine as a potential aid in grief work. Ketamine is a relatively new therapy which has been shown to promote the growth of new connections in the brain, which can help interrupt the cycle of persistent sadness and despair that often accompany grief. So tune in for that one. I think that'll be especially interesting. Thursday, May 30th is National Men in Grief Day, so join us for a special web broadcast for that day as well. And as I mentioned, if you missed any part of tonight's webcast, would like to watch it again or send the link to a friend or loved one, the links are posted on the Men's Grief Network website, the MGN Facebook page, and the Men's Grief Network YouTube channels. You can also watch all past webinars on the Men's Grief Network YouTube channel. And finally, if you have suggestions for future workshops, please email us at info@nationalwidowers.org. Check out our sites at mensgriefnetwork.org and nationalwidowers.org. We depend on your feedback to serve you better. So please keep in touch and let us know what you'd like to see more of or less of. And if you're watching us on YouTube, don't forget to like and subscribe. That really helps get the word out to other widowers, and hit the bell to be alerted for all upcoming NWO seminars. I'm your host, Ken Levy. Take good care of yourself. Thanks for joining us, and good night.